When it comes to a story as good as Mushoku Tensei, every detail helps to make the world that much more immersive. And while the anime does do a fantastic job showcasing mostly everything, there will always be more when it comes to the novels. Things like Lilia's backstory and how Rudy adapted to his new life, which were the core moments left behind from episode 1. So, as I go through the cut content I wasn't able to cover last season, I hope it'll serve as good preparation for season 2 next month. That's when I'll be starting the weekly cut contents again. Until then though, here's what we missed from the first part of season 1. Episode 1, Jobless Reincarnation, covering chapters 1 to 4 from volume 1 of the light novel. With Rudy's accident having been covered last video, we'll start things off right from when he awakens in his new life. His reincarnation that he wasn't even remotely aware of yet. So, while his initial thoughts were all related to what the damage from the accident was, the only thing he could think of after was just how awful his life was going to be. I mean, not only did he no longer have a place to live, but he was certain the accident likely left him maimed in some way. It wasn't until a few weeks later that he'd finally realized he'd been reborn somehow. Once that revelation had sunk in, the next thing Rudy discovered was that this wasn't Japan anymore. In fact, the medieval aesthetic made it clear that he wasn't in any developed nation. Like, with only candles and oil lamps to serve as lighting, his first guess was that his parents may have just been poor. That didn't really coincide with the fact that they could afford a full-time maid, but perhaps she was just a relative or something. Either way, if his goal was to go back and do everything over again, starting things off in a family that couldn't even afford utilities wasn't really the greatest foundation to work off of. Fast forward 6 more months, and Rudy could finally conclude that his family was in fact quite rich. You see, with such a massive house and a maid he determined was unrelated to them, he just assumed they were so far out in the boonies that the nearest power station couldn't reach them. It was a fact he was struggling to get over, as it meant he wouldn't be able to use a computer anymore. Of course, with magic being present instead, that struggle wasn't so much an issue as he became engrossed with that. He still couldn't say for certain that this wasn't Earth anymore, but after listening closely to the conversations of his parents, he started to realize the nouns he wasn't familiar with were actually the names of countries, regions, and territories. All places he knew definitely didn't exist on Earth. So, with this being a world of high fantasy unlike his own, Rudy began to see that what he previously thought as common sense didn't apply anymore. If swords and magic were the norm here, then those would be the things that would become the norm for him. He decided he would try his best to live as a typical person, doing the typical things any person in this world would do. It didn't matter if he stumbled along the way, because no matter what, he was going to forge his own path this time. His past self may have died feeling frustrated at the fact that he couldn't accomplish anything, but with this new life and the knowledge and experience from his last, this time he knew he could actually live life right, thus bringing us to the start of his story. Now, one of the major aspects of cut content was the entire chapter that focused on their maid, Lilia. Specifically her backstory and how she ended up at the Grey Rat household. Long story short, Lilia used to be a royal handmaiden and guardswoman for the Asura Palace harem. She was quite skilled at her duties as a handmaiden, but when it came to actual prowess in combat, her proficiency with a sword was mostly average. So when an assassin had come for the life of the newborn princess, while she was able to fend them off, their dagger, which was poisoned, had caught her leg. And because this was a toxin intended to kill a royal family member, it wasn't the type of poison that could be healed by magic. No, the only reason she was even still alive was simply due to the immediate attention from both healers and doctors. Overall, there wasn't really any damage done to her daily life, but the poison did make it so that she couldn't run anymore. She was effectively limited to a lopsided walk. A degraded physical condition definitely not fit for a royal guardswoman. That being the case, it was only natural she'd be relieved of her duty. A pleasant surprise considering that she was expecting to be executed. With such thorough knowledge of the inner workings of the palace, there was no doubt she'd be a target for the people coordinating these assassination attempts. So, to her, that was probably the reason they were even letting her go free in the first place. She felt they were trying to use her as bait to lure out the enemy. Now, that all could have just been paranoia, but the truth of the matter was that she was just this disposable lowborn who happened to be brought into the palace. I mean, even she didn't understand how she managed to land a job there. But with nothing tying her down to remain, the only logical choice was to leave the capital entirely, resulting in her finally ending up in the Fatoa region. Now, finding a new job was rather difficult, since any place that could afford to properly pay a handmaiden was likely already well acquainted with numerous connections in the capital, making it likely her identity and location would eventually become revealed to them. So, with the primary goal being to remain discreet, Lilia stumbled upon her position in the Buena village, a small hamlet at the far edge of the Fatoa region where a low-ranking knight was looking for a housekeeper and midwife. The location may have been a bit far even for her, but with the knight possessing a name that she recognized, Lilia knew that one way or the other she'd be able to get this job. Reason being that Paul was a student of the same master as her. Back when she'd been studying swordsmanship 7 years ago, he had randomly showed up after being disowned. He trained and became this prodigy, but didn't stay long as he'd abruptly left in hopes of becoming an adventurer. It was a brief period of time that Lilia could only describe as a hurricane. So, with this natural disaster of a person having settled down and married someone, Lilia could hardly believe that it was even him. But if it was in fact the Paul from her past, then she had more than enough stories lined up as bargaining chips to use against him. Luckily, they weren't necessary as Paul welcomed her with open arms. Now, after Rudeus was born, we all know that Lilia was rather repulsed by him. But it's the reason for that disgust that ties back to her past again. You see, it wasn't just his smile that disgusted her, but instead the things that devious grin reminded her of. It was the same look the ministers would give her when looking at her chest. The same smile that those in the capital who purchased young women as slaves possessed. So, with an unsettling demeanor that literally sent chills down her spine, Lilia truly felt that her body was at risk from a baby, much to the point that it could only be explained by something demonic. It reminded her of the time one of the Asuran princes had actually been possessed by one. He would roam around night after night all over the palace, then one night when an attendant went to retrieve him, he had actually grabbed a knife and stabbed her in the heart. This was the outcome Lilia was afraid of. Sure, Rudy may seem docile and calm right now, but the way he was currently acting was just as the prince did. She was certain she would wake up one night to find Rudy had killed everyone. It was only just a matter of time until it happened. So, with this being the way Lilia lived for the first year or so, fear would cause her to avoid Rudy and try rituals of banishment on him. Unfortunately for her, nothing would change his demeanor until the discovery of magic, specifically the textbook he'd found in the study. It was definitely still odd that a 1-year-old would stare at books all day acting as if he understood them, but this perceived intelligence made Rudy seem different. He no longer gave off this depraved aura that even his father didn't possess. A stark enough change that left her wondering why she was even so unsettled in the first place. Switching back to the perspective of Rudy, 2 years had passed in which that time was spent learning one of the most invaluable skills, the language. Since he knew just how valuable knowing English was in Japan, Rudy made becoming literate his primary goal. It was a task that became easier thanks to the 5 books he found in the study that one day. The first was a guide to the various countries of the world, the second a bestiary of the Fatoa region's monsters, the third a manual of attack spells ranging from beginner to advanced, the fourth a fairy tale centered around a summoner's epic battle against a demon to save the world, then the fifth the tale of 3 master swordsmen who delve into a massive labyrinth together. As we know from the anime, Rudy decided to focus on that textbook of magic, and it was here that we were given an extremely thorough look into exactly how the fundamentals of magic work in the world. It's not something I'm going to talk about right now, but if you are curious as to how this stuff works, I've already made a video covering most of it. As for the 4 core points that textbook covered, well, the first was the 3 types of magic a person can cast. The second, the requirement of magical power in order to use magic. The third, the 2 known ways of casting magic. Then the fourth, the misconception that the amount of magic someone can use is predetermined at birth. It's stuff we were all already pretty much aware of. Something that was cleverly shown solely through the animation was the actual feeling of what it was like to cast that magic. You see, the sensation that Rudy tries to emulate every time he's casting is the feeling of blood pooling at the magic's point of exit, then the manifestation of that blood into the magic he's envisioning. This was the process he would practice over and over. At first, it was all with the help of an incantation, but over time, Rudy came to find that that wasn't even necessary. He determined that putting oneself into the same mental space as how he'd cast it before was just as effective in reproducing the flow of magical power as the incantation. That being the case, if incantations were like the automatic version of casting, then silent casting would then be the manual version. He assumed it was something that just wasn't prevalent due to how mainstream incantations had become. If magicians grew up training with incantations their entire life, then the thousands of spells they'd come accustomed to using chants for would be impossible to do silently since their body just wouldn't know how to. There wouldn't be this association between the feeling in their mind and the magic they were casting. So that's why Rudy assumed there was no mention of it in the textbook. Now, it was 2 months later that Rudy would finally discover the full set of steps required to cast a spell to completion. It was a streamlined process that Rudy found could be modified in some ways. He didn't want to do anything too crazy just yet, but if he could master the fundamentals and continue to increase his reserves of magic, then he was pretty certain that almost anything was possible. He just needed to start small and work his way up. If he set goals that were too big for himself right from the beginning, then he knew from experience that that would only lead to disappointment. So, for the next year of his early childhood, Rudy would continue to practice his magic in secret, constantly building his capacity for it, all while mastering the art of silent spellcasting. The reason he didn't want anyone to know is because he still wasn't sure exactly how this world viewed magic yet. Yes, he did keep the textbook with him at all times, but he never read it in front of anyone since all he knew was that there could be witch hunts like how they had on Earth. He knew that likely wasn't the case, but just to be safe it was best to keep it hidden. It was the only for sure way to keep training himself in magic without any limitations. Now, once his parents did finally find out, there was a large part of Rudy that just wanted to avert his gaze and lie about it. But if there was one thing he'd learned during his time locked away at home, it was that getting defiant when you'd done something bad only went to make things worse. So, rather than avoid the situation, Rudy decided to face Zenith head-on, admit to his mistakes and show sincerity for doing so. If he could at least show sincerity, then that would most likely keep his parents' trust intact. There was time and time again where Rudy would tell lie after lie in his past life, but the only thing that would ever lead to was everyone eventually losing their trust in him. So that wasn't a mistake that Rudy was about to make for a second time. Of course, just like we saw in the anime, Zenith wasn't the least bit concerned about the damage he'd done. She was more so ecstatic that her son just proved himself to be a genius. If you look at it from the perspective of her, not only did Rudy just show he was capable of intermediate magic at the age of 3, but he'd also just shown he could read without anyone having taught him. It was a pretty impressive feat for just about any 3-year-old. It didn't really seem that impressive to Rudy, but he did understand why his parents thought so. It was just like how his previous parents treated his younger brother in his past life. So, with this being the event leading to Roxy, that's when we get to Rudy's phase as a student. Something we'll talk more about next episode. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this deeper look into Mushoku Tensei. If you want to see more or any other isekai content, then be sure to subscribe so you get notified. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!